At 3:06 a.m. local time, the war appeared to be moving in two opposite directions at once. On one side, reports emerged that Iran and the United States had received a plan for an immediate ceasefire. On the other side, Tehran was warning of devastating retaliation even as U.S.-Israeli attacks intensified, and pressure around the Strait of Hormuz remained unresolved. That contradiction is not a side note. It is the entire story tonight, because the most dangerous phase of a war is not always the opening strike. Sometimes, it is the moment an off-ramp appears, just as both sides are still preparing to push harder. That is when diplomacy and escalation stop running in sequence and start running in parallel. And when that happens, every hour becomes more dangerous than the one before it. This is not just a ceasefire story, and it is not just a threat story. It is the story of a conflict entering the unstable zone between exhaustion and escalation. A ceasefire plan suggests that at least some actors believe the current level of violence has become too risky, too expensive, or too politically difficult to sustain. A warning of devastating retaliation suggests that at least one actor still believes the threat of larger violence is necessary to shape the terms of any ending. Put those two signals together, and what you get is not peace. You get leverage warfare at its most dangerous stage, a stage where every side wants the war to stop on acceptable terms, but no side wants to be the one seen as having stopped under pressure. That is where this conflict now appears to be, and that is why tonight matters so much. Let me explain the significance of an immediate ceasefire plan, because the phrase sounds simple, but in real strategic terms it is anything but simple. A ceasefire plan is not peace. It is a mechanism, a temporary architecture, a proposal for how to stop active military actions long enough to prevent the conflict from widening further. But a ceasefire is only as strong as the incentives behind it. If both sides think they have more to gain from one more strike than from one more day of restraint, then the ceasefire becomes paper. And if one side believes the ceasefire freezes a disadvantage while the other believes it locks in gains, then the period immediately before a ceasefire is often when the war becomes most intense, because everyone is trying to improve the map, the narrative, and the balance before the clock stops. That is what makes the Iranian warning so significant. A warning of devastating retaliation during a ceasefire push suggests that Tehran is not yet prepared to let the conflict settle on terms it considers unacceptable. Even if Iran leaves the door open to diplomacy in principle, the threat language tells us it still sees value in coercive pressure. That could mean Tehran wants to strengthen its bargaining position before any ceasefire takes hold. It could mean it wants to deter further strikes during the negotiation window. Or it could mean that, from Iran's perspective, the ceasefire proposal itself is not enough unless it comes with guarantees, sequencing, or limits that preserve deterrence. Now look at the battlefield side of this equation. Reports that U.S.-Israeli attacks are intensifying, while a ceasefire proposal is circulating, tell us the conflict has entered a race condition. One track is diplomatic, the other is operational, and they may not be synchronized. Militaries do not stop because diplomats exchange plans. They stop when orders change, incentives change, and commanders believe that stopping now is safer or more useful than firing again. Until that moment arrives, the war can still produce some of its most dangerous moves precisely because everyone knows a pause may be coming. This is the hidden logic of late-stage escalation. If the shooting may stop soon, then every actor asks the same question. What can still be achieved before it does? Washington may ask whether more pressure can produce a more favorable ceasefire framework. Israel may ask whether critical threats can still be degraded before operations freeze. Tehran may ask whether stronger retaliation threats, or actual limited retaliation, can prevent the ceasefire from looking like a capitulation. Gulf states may ask whether the ceasefire is real enough to justify calmer posture, or too fragile to trust. And markets may ask whether any off-ramp is credible, while strikes and threats are still actively intensifying. That last point matters more than it seems. Markets are often a more honest indicator of escalation risk than political language. If energy traders, shippers, and insurers behave as if the war still has room to widen, that tells you the strategic community does not yet believe the ceasefire architecture is stable. And with Hormuz still unresolved, that instability carries far beyond the battlefield. A ceasefire that does not address maritime risk is not really a full de-escalation. It is only a pause in one domain while another remains under pressure. That is why the Strait of Hormuz remains central even in a ceasefire conversation. Hormuz is not a side theater. It is the point where regional conflict becomes global economic consequence. If Iran rejects a deadline related to Hormuz while ceasefire talks circulate, then the message is clear. Tehran does not want maritime coercion or maritime access to be treated as a settled issue simply because a broader ceasefire framework is being discussed. For Washington and its partners, that is a serious problem. Because a ceasefire that leaves the world's most important oil choke point under threat is not a stable end state. It is only a different kind of instability. Defense math, Now here's the defense math of a ceasefire moment, because this is where many observers misunderstand how dangerous these periods can be. The side trying to sustain military pressure before a possible ceasefire can often gain more with one final wave than with several ordinary days of fighting. Why? Because the psychological value of the last strike before a pause is often greater than the first strike after one. A final strike can shape perceptions, shift bargaining power, and alter the narrative of who stopped because they wanted to and who stopped because they had to. That means the hours before a potential ceasefire can become disproportionately intense. At the same time, the defensive burden remains maximal. Air defense systems cannot assume calm because a plan exists on paper. Naval forces cannot relax because an intermediary is talking to both sides. Bases cannot reduce alert because a source says a ceasefire proposal has been delivered. Every missile battery, every radar site, every ship, every pilot, every rescue team, every command bunker has to continue operating as if escalation remains possible. And escalation remains possible because in the very moment diplomacy appears, the incentive to force one final change on the battlefield often increases. This is why ceasefire periods can be expensive. Interceptors are still spent, aircraft still fly, naval forces still posture, infrastructure remains vulnerable, political leaders still prepare retaliation options, in case the other side uses the negotiation window to attack. In pure systems terms, a ceasefire plan does not lower risk immediately. Sometimes it raises it temporarily by compressing time and increasing incentives for pre-ceasefire action. That is exactly the kind of environment Iran's devastating retaliation warning fits into. It is not only a military threat, it is a bargaining instrument. It says, do not mistake the existence of a proposal for acceptance of the terms. Do not assume that because a ceasefire framework exists, Iran's deterrence calculus has disappeared. Do not believe the pressure clock has stopped. In strategic language, it is a way of keeping the cost of noncompliance visible while diplomacy is being tested. Now look at the United States through that lens. If Washington has indeed received a ceasefire plan, then it must decide whether to treat that plan as a genuine opening or as one more phase in the pressure game. If the administration sees an opportunity for a controlled stop, it may want to maintain enough force to discourage Iranian brinkmanship, while avoiding actions that collapse the diplomatic track entirely. That is a very narrow path. Too much pressure, and Tehran may decide the ceasefire is a trap. Too little pressure, and Tehran may conclude that threats are working. Finding the balance is difficult even in calmer wars. In one this volatile, it becomes extraordinarily hard. Israel faces a related but distinct dilemma. A ceasefire can be attractive only if it does not leave unacceptable threats in place. If key launch capability, infrastructure support, or strategic pressure points remain active, then a ceasefire can feel less like a solution and more like a timeout that benefits the side still able to regenerate risk. That means Israeli calculations about any ceasefire are unlikely to be based only on diplomatic optics. They will be based on what the battlefield looks like the minute the guns go quiet. If that picture is judged too dangerous, support for a ceasefire becomes more conditional. And then there are the Gulf states, who may be the most eager for a real de-escalation, but the least able to trust one until they see evidence. For Gulf governments, a ceasefire is valuable only if it lowers the risk to ports, airports, water systems, oil infrastructure, and shipping lanes. A ceasefire that slows direct strikes but leaves the broader pressure map intact does not solve the real problem. The Gulf's fear is not only bombs, it is exposure. Exposure to disruption, exposure to market panic, exposure to being the space where other powers signal resolve to each other. That is why wider regional actors may publicly welcome a ceasefire plan, while privately preparing for the possibility that it fails within hours. Now let's bring in the rescue of the second F-15 airmen from Iran, because even though it seems like a separate event, it is deeply connected to the strategic picture. Rescue operations inside hostile territory reinforce the sense that the conflict is still operating at a very high level of risk and penetration. They show that aircraft are being lost, personnel are vulnerable, and the United States is willing to undertake dangerous missions inside Iranian space to recover them. In political terms, such rescues can create a short-term sense of success. In strategic terms, they can also intensify the prestige logic of the conflict. Iran sees intrusion, Washington sees resolve. Both sides emerge with stronger reasons not to appear weak in the next phase. The prestige factor matters in ceasefire dynamics. Because if leaders think domestic or international audiences will interpret a ceasefire as backing down after a dramatic rescue, after harsh threats, or after intensified strikes, then the pressure to harden pre-ceasefire messaging grows even more. This is why conflict resolution at moments like this often feels paradoxical. The more obvious it becomes that a war needs an off-ramp, the more dangerous the final approach to that off-ramp can become. What happens next? So what happens next? First, Watch whether the ceasefire plan gains visible political endorsement or remains a quiet proposal floating through intermediaries. A real ceasefire begins to acquire public shape, terms, sequencing, conditions, or at least coordinated language. If none of that appears, then the plan may be more aspiration than mechanism. Second, watch whether battlefield tempo changes. If attacks continue intensifying, even as ceasefire talk grows louder, that tells you all sides are still trying to shape the map before any pause. That is a warning sign, not a reassuring one. Third, watch Tehran's language. If devastating retaliation remains in the rhetoric without visible military preparation, that may suggest coercive diplomacy. If the rhetoric is paired with movement or activity across military, proxy, or maritime channels, the risk rises sharply. Fourth, watch Hormuz. A ceasefire plan that does not address maritime pressure is structurally weak. Any sign that shipping risk remains elevated means the most globally sensitive part of the crisis is still active. Fifth, watch Gulf posture. Increased alerts around infrastructure, ports, airports, and military sites will tell you whether the region believes a ceasefire is credible or merely notional. Here's the bottom line. A reported immediate ceasefire plan and a simultaneous Iranian warning of devastating retaliation tell us this war has entered the most unstable phase of all. The phase where diplomacy is possible, but not yet stronger than escalation. That is an inherently dangerous phase because all sides still have incentives to move, threaten, posture, and pressure before the pause becomes real. In one line, the ceasefire may be on the table, but the war is still trying to decide who sits at it from a position of strength. That is why tonight matters. Because when a conflict reaches the point where both peace plans and devastating retaliation warnings are circulating at the same time, you are not looking at the end of the war. You are looking at the fight over the ending. And in many wars, that fight is one of the most explosive stages of all. The proposal matters. The threat matters. Hormuz matters. The intensifying strikes matter. And together they reveal a conflict balanced on a narrow edge between a managed pause and a wider regional shock. Until one side shows it values the architecture of de-escalation more than the leverage of one more warning or one more strike, that edge remains dangerously unstable.